Rachel Morrison kept a jar of beach glass on her kitchen windowsill, each piece smoothed by Lake Michigan's waves, collected during family trips to the shore. In June 1989, the 28-year-old elementary school teacher disappeared after her evening jog in Traverse City, Michigan. She left behind lesson plans for Monday's class, a golden retriever named Sam, who waited by the door for weeks, and parents whose smiles never quite reached their eyes again. Her running shoes were found near the Cherry Bend Trail, laces still tied. For 33 years, Rachel's father walked that trail every Sunday morning, his hand brushing the trees she might have touched, searching for something he couldn't name. Then, in October 2022, genealogical DNA testing revealed a match that had been waiting in databases for years. The evidence pointed to someone who had known Rachel, someone who had been part of the search parties that combed those woods for weeks. What the family would learn would prove that evil doesn't always announce itself with a stranger's face. This is a story about a father's love that refused to surrender to silence. It's about Rachel's dream of teaching children to love reading the way she did, about the student who still remembered how she acted out every character voice. And it's about the moment when decades of questions finally found their answer, even if the answer brought as much pain as peace. If you value stories like this and want to see more investigations into cold cases that were finally solved, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Please write your country in the comments below. Let's see how far around the world these stories travel. The morning of June 14, 1989, started the way most Wednesdays did for the Morrison family. Rachel woke at 5:30 a.m., exactly as she had every weekday for the past 6 years. The alarm clock, a dusty blue plastic one with glowing green numbers, buzzed on her nightstand. She reached over and silenced it, with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. She padded downstairs in her bare feet, Sam following close behind, his golden tail wagging hopefully. The house was quiet in that particular way. Houses are just before dawn, when the rest of the world is still sleeping and you feel like you have the morning all to yourself. Rachel liked that feeling. It made her think of snow days when she was young, of Christmas mornings, of moments that felt stolen from ordinary time. She made coffee in the percolator that had belonged to her grandmother, the one with the small dent on the side from when her grandfather had dropped it during a camping trip in 1962. The coffee grounds smelled like comfort, like every morning she'd ever watched her grandmother stand at the stove, humming old hymns while she waited for the coffee to brew. Rachel hummed too, though she couldn't carry a tune to save her life. Sam didn't seem to mind. While the coffee percolated, Rachel sat at the kitchen table and pulled out a stack of spelling tests from her bag. 23 tests, one from each of her third graders. She'd promised them she'd have them graded by Thursday, and Rachel Morrison never broke a promise to her students. She clicked her red pen, then paused and traded it for a purple one. Red felt too harsh, like blood on paper. Purple felt gentler, more encouraging. She worked through the stack methodically. Aiden had spelled Wednesday wrong again, mixing up the D and the E. Rachel drew a small smiley face next to his attempt and wrote, "You're getting closer. Remember, Wednesday, 3 syllables." Sarah Chen had gotten every word perfect, her letters small and precise. Rachel drew a star at the top of her page and added, "I'm so proud of your hard work." The spelling tests took 45 minutes. By the time she finished, the coffee was ready and the sky outside was starting to lighten, purple giving way to pink and gold. Rachel poured herself a cup, added 2 sugars and a splash of milk, and stood at the kitchen window watching the day arrive. A robin hopped across the lawn. The neighbor's sprinkler system turned on with a quiet hiss. Somewhere down the street, a car started. Her mother, Dorothy Morrison, would later tell investigators that Rachel seemed lighter that morning. Not in a physical sense, though Rachel had always been petite, barely 5'3", 110 pounds soaking wet. Lighter in her spirit, like something heavy had been lifted from her shoulders. Dorothy had stopped by around 7 a.m., the way she did most Wednesday mornings, bringing a loaf of banana bread she'd baked the night before. She found Rachel in the shower, singing off-key to a Whitney Houston song. When Rachel came downstairs, her hair wrapped in a towel, Dorothy was sitting at the kitchen table with Sam's head in her lap. "You seem happy," Dorothy had said, studying her daughter's face. Rachel smiled, the kind of smile that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. "I am happy," she said. "Is that weird?" "It's wonderful," Dorothy said. And it was. Rachel had been through a rough patch the year before, a breakup with a boyfriend who'd turned out to be less than she'd hoped, some struggles with a particularly difficult class at school, a winter that seemed to stretch on forever. But spring had brought change, new beginnings, hope. She'd been dating someone new, a paralegal named Tom Brennan, who worked downtown at a law firm that specialized in estate planning. They'd met at a fundraiser for the local library, had bonded over their shared love of mystery novels and terrible puns. Tom was kind, steady, the sort of person who called when he said he would, who showed up on time, who listened when Rachel talked about her students. There was talk of meeting his parents over the 4th of July weekend. Rachel was nervous, but excited. It felt real in a way her last relationship never had. She told her mother about it while they ate banana bread. Tom had taken her to dinner the night before, a small Italian place on Front Street where the owner knew everyone's name. He'd talked about taking her sailing on the lake, about a cabin his family owned up near Mackinac Island, about the future in a way that didn't feel scary. Rachel described the way he'd held her hand across the table, the way he'd walked her to her car and kissed her goodnight like they had all the time in the world. Dorothy listened, her heart full. This was what she'd prayed for. Rachel happy, Rachel loved, Rachel building a life. "He sounds lovely," Dorothy said. "He is," Rachel agreed. "I really think he might be the one, Mom." Those words would echo in Dorothy's mind for decades. I really think he might be the one. Present tense, future tense, a life imagined but never lived. After Dorothy left, Rachel finished getting ready. She chose her clothes carefully, a yellow sundress with white flowers, sandals that were comfortable enough for a day on her feet, but still looked nice. She packed her lunch, a turkey sandwich on wheat bread, an apple from the tree in her parents' backyard, a thermos of iced tea sweetened with honey. She added a chocolate chip cookie from the batch her roommate Jenna had baked over the weekend. Teaching third graders required energy, and sugar helped. She kissed Sam's head, scratched behind his ears the way he liked, and told him to be good. Sam watched her from his spot by the door, his tail thumping against the hardwood floor. He always knew when she was leaving. Sometimes he'd whine, pressing his nose against the window to watch her car pull away. But this morning, he just sat there, patient and trusting, certain she'd come home like she always did. Rachel promised she'd be home by 4. They'd go for a walk, she told him. Maybe down to the park where he could chase tennis balls until he was too tired to move. She never made it home. Rachel taught until 3:15 that afternoon. Room 14 at Elmwood Elementary was her kingdom, a bright space with alphabet letters dancing along the top of the chalkboard, student artwork covering every available wall, and shelves crammed with books Rachel had collected from garage sales and library donations. The room smelled like pencil shavings and the lavender soap she kept by the sink for hand washing. Her students filed in after lunch with the particular energy of 8-year-olds who'd just spent 45 minutes running around the playground. Aiden Mitchell had grass stains on his knees. Sarah Chen carried a jar with a caterpillar she'd found by the swings. Marcus Johnson was wearing his shirt inside out and didn't seem to notice or care. Rachel loved them fiercely, every single one. Even Christopher Wade, who spent most of his time drawing elaborate battle scenes in the margins of his math worksheets instead of actually doing the math. Even Emma Chen, Sarah's younger sister, who was so shy she'd barely spoken the first 3 months of school. Even Tyler Banks, who had a learning disability that made reading feel like climbing a mountain, but who worked harder than anyone Rachel had ever taught. That afternoon, they were supposed to be finishing their book reports. Rachel had let them choose any book they wanted from the class library, and the results were wonderfully varied. Sarah Chen had chosen Charlotte's Web and had cried when she got to the part where Charlotte dies. Aiden had picked a book about dinosaurs and had somehow turned his report into a lecture about why T-Rex was overrated and velociraptors were actually the cooler predator. Marcus had read a biography of Jackie Robinson and had asked Rachel questions about segregation that she'd done her best to answer honestly, age-appropriately, truthfully. But the students were restless that Wednesday. It was June, almost summer vacation, and the pull of freedom was strong. Rachel could feel them slipping away, mentally already at the beach or summer camp or sleeping late with no alarm clocks. She didn't blame them. She'd been 8 once. She remembered that feeling. So instead of forcing them to focus on book reports, Rachel made a decision. She closed the classroom door, lowered the shades slightly to create the feeling of a theater, and gathered the students on the reading rug at the front of the room. "Story time," she announced. The students cheered. Story time was the best part of any day at Elmwood. Rachel had a gift for it, the way she brought characters to life, changing her voice for each one, adding sound effects, pausing dramatically at just the right moments. She picked up a worn copy of the BFG by Roald Dahl, a book she'd read at least 20 times to various classes over the years, and began to read. For 40 minutes, her students sat entranced. They giggled at the BFG's funny language, gasped when the other giants appeared, held their breath during the scary parts. Rachel read with her whole heart, becoming the giant, becoming Sophie, becoming the Queen of England. She loved this, the way books could transport children somewhere else, the way stories could make them forget everything except the adventure unfolding in their minds. When she finished the chapter, the dismissal bell rang. The students groaned, not ready to leave. Rachel promised they'd continue tomorrow, even though she wasn't sure she'd be here tomorrow. Tom had mentioned something about a surprise for Thursday night, and she wondered if maybe he was planning something special. Maybe he'd ask her to be exclusive, to be his girlfriend officially. The thought made her stomach flutter. The students gathered their backpacks, their jackets, their half-finished art projects, and forgotten lunchboxes. They filed out in their usual chaos, voices bouncing off the hallway walls. Rachel stood at the door, giving high fives and reminding them about homework they probably wouldn't do. Emma Chen was the last to leave. She was 7, even smaller than her older sister Sarah, with the same dark hair and serious eyes. Emma hung back while the other students left, clutching a piece of paper she'd been working on during recess. "Miss Morrison?" she said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart?" Emma held out the drawing. It showed their class standing beneath a rainbow, every child rendered in careful crayon. Each student had their name written in uneven letters above their head. At the center, taller than the students, was a figure in a yellow dress. Miss Morrison. Emma had drawn her with a smile and flowers in her hands. Rachel felt something catch in her throat. These moments, these small gestures of love from children who barely knew how to express what they were feeling, these were the moments that made teaching worth every frustration, every late-night grading papers, every morning she woke up exhausted. "This is beautiful," Rachel said, and she meant it. "I wanted you to remember us," Emma said. "When school's over, I don't want you to forget." Rachel knelt down to Emma's level. She took the little girl's hands in her own. "I could never forget you," she said. "Any of you. You're all in here." She tapped her chest, over her heart. "Forever." Emma smiled, that rare sunshine smile that transformed her whole face, and threw her arms around Rachel's neck. Rachel hugged her back, breathing in the smell of playground dust and grape juice and childhood innocence. When Emma left, skipping down the hallway to catch up with her sister, Rachel stood in the doorway of room 14 and watched her go. She turned back to her empty classroom, to the desks arranged in neat rows, to the rainbow drawing Emma had given her. She walked to her desk and taped it carefully to the surface, right next to a photo of Sam and a coffee mug that said, "Teachers change the world one child at a time." It was the last thing she did in her classroom, the last moment of normal before everything changed. Later, so many people would remember that afternoon. They'd remember Rachel's yellow sundress, the way it swayed when she walked. They'd remember her smile, the genuine warmth of it. They'd remember how she'd stopped to help another teacher carry books to her car, how she'd held the door for a parent picking up their kindergartner, how she'd waved to the principal as she left. She seemed happy, everyone would say. She seemed like someone looking forward to the evening ahead, and she was. After school, Rachel stopped at the grocery store. The receipt, time-stamped 3:42 p.m., showed she bought orange juice, pasta, and a bouquet of daisies. The cashier remembered her because Rachel had joked about trying to cook something impressive for Tom's upcoming visit. She was terrible in the kitchen, she'd said, laughing. The cashier smiled and wished her luck. That small exchange, so ordinary it barely registered at the time, would be dissected and studied and replayed in the years to come. Rachel drove home, changed into her running clothes, a gray tank top, navy shorts, her favorite Nike sneakers with the bright orange swoosh. She left a note on the fridge for her roommate Jenna. Gone for a run. Cherry Bend. Back by 6:30. Dinner? The note would still be there 2 days later when police searched the house, the magnet holding it in place shaped like a tiny apple, a gift from one of her students. The Cherry Bend Trail was Rachel's ritual. She ran there 4 times a week, usually alone, sometimes with Jenna or a friend from the teacher's lounge. It was a 3-mile loop that wound through oak and birch trees, alongside the lake, past benches where older couples sat watching the sunset. In June, the trail bloomed with wildflowers, purple lupine and black-eyed Susans, and the air smelled like pine and fresh water. It was the kind of place that felt safe, the kind of place where people walked their dogs and teenagers kissed on the bluffs overlooking the water. Rachel parked her Toyota Corolla in the gravel lot at 5:15 p.m. A woman named Margaret Pratt, walking her collie, saw Rachel stretching near the trailhead, adjusting her headphones, securing her ponytail. Margaret waved. Rachel waved back. Just a neighborly acknowledgement between 2 people who'd passed each other dozens of times before. Margaret would later say that Rachel looked happy, at ease, like someone without a worry in the world. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rachel Morrison alive. By 7 p.m., Jenna started to worry. Rachel was never late. It wasn't in her nature. She was the kind of person who showed up 15 minutes early to everything, who called if she was going to be even 5 minutes behind schedule, who hated making people wait. Jenna tried calling the school, thinking maybe Rachel had stayed late to prepare for the field trip they'd planned for Friday, a visit to the local nature center where the students would learn about native Michigan plants and wildlife. The phone rang and rang. No answer. Jenna called Dorothy next, trying to keep her voice casual, not wanting to alarm Rachel's mother over nothing. But Dorothy hadn't heard from her either. Neither had Bill, Rachel's father. By 7:15, Jenna called Tom Brennan, the paralegal Rachel was dating. Tom said he'd spoken to Rachel around noon, just a quick call to confirm their plans for the weekend. She'd sounded fine, he said. Happy. By 7:30, Bill Morrison had left his house and was driving toward the Cherry Bend Trail. He knew Rachel's routine as well as his own. Cherry Bend on Wednesdays and Saturdays, the same 3-mile loop she'd been running since she graduated from college. Bill's hands shook on the steering wheel. He told himself he was overreacting. Rachel probably just lost track of time, or maybe she'd run into a friend, or maybe there'd been a problem with her car and she was walking home. But when he pulled into the gravel parking lot and saw Rachel's Toyota Corolla sitting exactly where she'd left it, his stomach dropped. The car was a pale blue, 4 years old, with a bumper sticker that said, "Teachers plant seeds of knowledge," and another that showed a golden retriever wearing glasses. Bill approached it slowly, as if moving too fast might make it disappear. The driver's side door was unlocked. Rachel's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet visible inside, credit cards and cash untouched. Her keys were in the ignition, still attached to the keychain he'd given her for her 21st birthday, a small pewter apple with her initials engraved on it. Bill's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the car door. Later, he would describe this moment as the one where his life split into before and after. There was the Bill Morrison who existed before he saw his daughter's empty car, and there was the Bill Morrison who existed after. They were not the same person. He shouted her name into the woods. "Rachel! Rachel!" His voice cracked, raw and desperate. The sound bounced off the trees and returned to him empty, unanswered. Other joggers who'd just finished their runs stopped, asked if he needed help. A woman in her 60s, Margaret Pratt, recognized Bill from church. She put her hand on his shoulder, asked what was wrong. When Bill explained, Margaret's face went pale. "I saw her," Margaret said, "around 5:15. She was stretching near the trailhead. She waved at me." "Did you see where she went?" Bill asked. "Onto the trail," Margaret said. "Toward the lake. She had her headphones on. She looked happy." Happy. That word again. Rachel had looked happy. Within 10 minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Joggers, dog walkers, a couple who'd been having a picnic near the lake. They spread out, calling Rachel's name, sweeping flashlights across the darkening trail. Someone, Bill couldn't remember who, called 911 at 7:52 p.m. The Traverse City Police Department responded with the urgency that missing person cases demand in the first critical hours. Officers arrived in 3 patrol cars, their lights flashing red and blue across the gravel lot, transforming the peaceful parking area into something that looked like a crime scene. Which, though no one wanted to say it out loud yet, it probably was. Sergeant Tom Riley, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, took charge immediately. He questioned Bill, getting the basic facts. When did Rachel arrive? What was she wearing? Did she have any medical conditions that might cause her to become disoriented? Did she have enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? Bill answered as best he could, though his voice kept breaking, his hands kept shaking. Gray tank top, navy shorts, Nike sneakers with orange swooshes. No medical conditions. No enemies. Rachel didn't have enemies. Everyone loved Rachel. By 9 p.m., the trail was swarming with volunteers. Word had spread through Traverse City with the speed that bad news always travels in small towns. Neighbors who'd heard about the missing teacher. Parents whose children had been in Rachel's class. Teachers from Elmwood Elementary who couldn't sit at home knowing one of their own was missing. They arrived with flashlights and thermoses of coffee, with search dogs and first aid kits, with determination written on their faces. Dorothy Morrison arrived just before 9:30. She'd been at a church meeting when Bill called, and she'd driven to the trail so fast she'd later find a speeding ticket in her mailbox that she had no memory of receiving. When she saw Rachel's car, still sitting in the parking lot with the keys in the ignition, she made a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking. Bill caught her as her knees buckled. They stood there together in the parking lot, holding each other up, while police officers and volunteers organized into search teams. Sergeant Riley approached them gently, explained what they were doing. Grid search pattern. K-9 units. Helicopter at first light if necessary. They would find her, he said. But his eyes, kind but honest, didn't make any promises he couldn't keep. The search teams headed out onto the trail armed with industrial flashlights that turned night into artificial day. They walked in lines, shoulder to shoulder, calling Rachel's name. The sound of dozens of voices shouting the same word over and over, Rachel, 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 created a strange echo through the woods, like a prayer, like a spell, like they could summon her back through sheer force of will. They found her shoes at 10:30 p.m. Officer Dave Martinez, a young cop 2 years out of the academy, spotted them first. 2 miles into the trail, near a bend where the path curved close to Lake Michigan, Rachel's Nike sneakers sat side by side on a flat rock. They looked placed, intentional, not kicked off in haste or lost in a struggle. The laces were still tied. There was no other sign of her, no footprints leading away, no torn clothing snagged on branches, no blood, just the shoes, sitting there like she'd simply decided to take them off and walk away barefoot. Officer Martinez had been trained on how to preserve a crime scene. He knew not to touch anything, knew to call for his supervisor, knew to mark the area and keep people back. But for just a moment, he stood there staring at those shoes and felt sick. He had a younger sister, 26, who loved to run. He thought about her shoes, how she tied them tight before every jog, how she'd come home with blisters and sore muscles and still go out again the next day because running made her feel free. He radioed it in. Within minutes, Sergeant Riley was at the scene with the crime scene techs. They photographed everything. The shoes from every angle, the rock they sat on, the dirt around them, the trees overhead, the distance to the lake. They bagged the shoes carefully, preserving them for evidence, though evidence of what no one yet knew. The K-9 units arrived shortly after. German shepherds trained in search and rescue, their noses capable of detecting human scent invisible to any other creature. Their handlers gave them Rachel's scent from a sweatshirt retrieved from her car. The dogs sniffed it, noses working, tails alert. Then they set off onto the trail, pulling hard against their leads. They followed a path for about 50 yards past where the shoes were found. Then they stopped, circled, whined, tried again. The handlers urged them on, following standard protocols, but the dogs seemed confused. They'd pick up the scent, follow it a few feet, then lose it again. It was as if Rachel's trail simply evaporated. One of the handlers, a woman named Susan Klein, who'd been working with search and rescue dogs for 15 years, pulled Sergeant Riley aside. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "The scent should be stronger here, not weaker. It's like she just disappeared." "Could the lake interfere?" Riley asked. "The wind off the water?" Susan shook her head. "We've done plenty of searches near water. The dogs can usually work through it. This is different. It's like the trail just ends." They kept trying, expanding the search radius, taking the dogs in different directions. But nothing worked. Whatever had happened to Rachel Morrison, it had happened quickly and completely. No long struggle through the woods, no trail to follow. Just a pair of shoes, and then nothing. Dorothy Morrison arrived at the trail just after midnight. She'd insisted, even though Bill and the police both tried to convince her to wait at home. She needed to walk this trail herself, she said. Needed to see where her daughter had been last seen. Needed to feel close to her somehow. Bill walked beside her, one arm around her shoulders, both of them moving like ghosts through the beams of flashlights and headlamps. Volunteers stepped aside respectfully as they passed, offering quiet words of encouragement. "We'll find her, Mrs. Morrison. Don't give up hope. She's out there somewhere." But Dorothy could feel the lie in those words. She was a mother. She knew her child. And some deep, terrible instinct told her that Rachel was gone. Not lost. Gone. The difference mattered, though she couldn't have explained how. When they reached the spot where Rachel's shoes had been found, Dorothy sank to her knees. The rock was still there, empty now, the shoes taken away as evidence. Dorothy pressed her hands to the cold stone, as if she could feel some lingering warmth from her daughter, some trace of her presence. She stayed there for a long time, minutes that felt like hours, while Bill stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder and tried not to break down. "She was here," Dorothy whispered. "My baby was right here." Bill couldn't answer. His throat was too tight, his chest too heavy. He just held his wife while she wept, while the search parties continued combing the woods around them, while the night grew colder and the stars came out overhead, indifferent and infinite and impossibly far away. The search continued through the night and into the next day. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating the air. Divers suited up and descended into the cold, dark water of Lake Michigan, searching the shallows, checking for any sign of a body caught in the rocks or weeds. The Coast Guard deployed boats, sweeping the shoreline. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the woods, calling Rachel's name until their voices went hoarse. By Friday, the story had made regional news. Missing teacher, Traverse City woman. Vanishes during evening run. Rachel's photograph appeared on television screens across northern Michigan, her smiling face frozen in a moment of joy, a picture taken at a school picnic just 3 weeks earlier. Tips started flooding in. Someone thought they'd seen a woman matching Rachel's description at a gas station in Cadillac. Another caller swore they'd passed her hitchhiking near Interlaken. Every lead was followed, every sighting investigated. None of them led anywhere. Investigators began to look closer at Rachel's life. They interviewed Tom, the paralegal she'd been dating. He had an alibi. He'd been in court until 5 p.m., then met friends at a bar downtown. Security footage confirmed it. They spoke to Rachel's ex-boyfriend from college, a man she'd broken up with 2 years earlier. He was living in Grand Rapids, had remarried, showed no interest in Rachel's life. They questioned Jenna, her roommate, her co-workers, her neighbors. Everyone painted the same picture. Rachel was kind, responsible, loved by everyone who knew her. She had no enemies, no debts, no secrets dark enough to explain her disappearance. Still, The police did what they always do in cases like this. They suspected the people closest to her first. Bill Morrison, Rachel's father, was questioned 3 times in the first week. Detectives asked about his relationship with his daughter, whether they'd argued recently, where he'd been on the afternoon she vanished. Bill answered every question with a patience born of desperation. He knew they had to ask. He would have asked the same things. But it hollowed him out, the idea that anyone could think he'd harm his own child. By the end of June, the initial search had slowed. The volunteers went home. The helicopters stopped circling. Life, with its cruel insistence, continued. People returned to work, to their routines, to problems that felt manageable. But for the Morrisons, time stopped on June 14th, 1989, and never started again. Rachel's classroom at Elmwood Elementary sat empty for the rest of the school year. The principal brought in a substitute, but the students knew something was terribly wrong. Emma Chen, the quiet girl who'd given Rachel the rainbow drawing, stopped talking for weeks. Other children asked when Miss Morrison was coming back, and no one knew how to answer. Eventually, a grief counselor was brought in to help the kids process what had happened, though most of them were too young to understand that their teacher might never return. Dorothy Morrison couldn't bring herself to enter Rachel's room. It stayed exactly as she'd left it. The bed made, the closet full of clothes organized by color, a stack of library books on the nightstand with bookmarks still tucked inside. Sometimes Dorothy would stand in the doorway and just look, trying to memorize every detail, as if the room itself could tell her where her daughter had gone. Bill coped differently. He became obsessed with the case. He made copies of every police report, every witness statement, every search grid map. He covered the walls of his garage with timelines, theories, photographs. He drove to the Cherry Bend Trail every Sunday, walking the same 3-mile loop Rachel had run, searching for something the police might have missed. He talked to other joggers, asked if they'd seen anything unusual, handed out flyers with Rachel's face on them until his hands were black with ink. The police file grew thick with dead ends. A psychic contacted the department, claiming to have visions of Rachel near water, but couldn't provide specifics. A convicted sex offender who'd been released from prison 3 months before Rachel's disappearance became a person of interest, but his alibi checked out. He'd been working at a construction site in Petoskey the day she vanished. A teenager came forward saying he'd seen a man in a white van parked near the trail that evening, but he couldn't remember the license plate or describe the driver beyond vague details. Every thread investigators pulled unraveled into nothing. As the months passed, the case began to fade from public attention. By the fall of 1989, Rachel's story was buried beneath newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. The police kept the file open, but with no new leads, there was little they could do. Rachel Morrison became another name in a growing list of people who'd vanished without explanation, their families left to navigate a grief with no closure, no body, no answers. But Bill Morrison refused to let go. He wrote letters to senators, to the FBI, to television producers who covered missing persons cases. He started a foundation in Rachel's name, raising money to keep her story alive, to fund searches for other missing people. He appeared on local news programs every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, holding up her photograph, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Dorothy supported him, but the years wore her down in ways that frightened Bill. She stopped sleeping, started taking pills to quiet the nightmares. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink with each passing year. Friends tried to help, bringing casseroles and kind words, but nothing filled the hole Rachel had left. In 1995, 6 years after Rachel vanished, the Morrisons received a call from a detective in Wisconsin. A body had been found in a wooded area near Green Bay, a woman in her 20s, cause of death undetermined. Could they provide dental records for comparison? Bill and Dorothy drove to the morgue, their hearts pounding with a terrible hope. But the dental records didn't match. It wasn't Rachel. The relief was as crushing as the disappointment. They didn't know whether to be grateful or devastated. The years blurred together after that. 1996, 2000, 2005, each one marked by the same ritual. Bill walking the Cherry Bend Trail, Dorothy lighting a candle in the window, both of them waiting for a phone call that never came. And then, in 2010, something shifted. A young detective named Sarah Lindgren joined the Traverse City Police Department's cold case unit. She was 29, the same age Rachel had been when she disappeared, and she'd grown up hearing the story. Sarah's mother had been a teacher at Elmwood, had known Rachel, had cried when she went missing. Sarah requested the Morrison file on her first day and spent weeks reading through every page, every report, every witness statement. What struck Sarah most wasn't what was in the file. It was what wasn't. The original investigation had focused heavily on strangers, transient workers, known offenders passing through the area. But there was very little follow-up on the people who'd been closest to Rachel. Not because detectives suspected them, but because everyone had seemed so cooperative, so eager to help. Sarah wondered if that eagerness had been a blind spot. She started over, re-interviewing everyone who'd been part of Rachel's life in 1989. Most were still in the area, their lives shaped in small ways by the memory of the woman they'd lost. Tom, the paralegal Rachel had been dating, was now a judge. Jenna, her roommate, taught history at a local high school and still teared up when she talked about Rachel. Emma Chen, the student who'd given Rachel the rainbow drawing, was a social worker in Lansing and kept a photo of her third-grade class on her desk. And then there was Greg Hartman. Greg had been a volunteer in the original search effort, a local contractor who'd spent days combing the woods for any sign of Rachel. In 1989, he'd been 26, married, the father of a newborn daughter. He'd lived 2 streets away from the Cherry Bend Trail and had told police he often jogged there himself, that he'd seen Rachel running several times, but never spoken to her beyond a polite nod. When Sarah pulled his file, she noticed something odd. Greg had been interviewed once, briefly, in the days immediately after Rachel vanished, but his alibi had never been fully verified. He'd claimed he was home with his wife and baby the evening of June 14th, and that had been enough. No one had pressed further. Sarah decided to talk to him. Greg Hartman was now 56, a grandfather, still working as a contractor in Traverse City. He agreed to meet Sarah at his office, a small warehouse filled with tools and lumber and the smell of sawdust. When she arrived, he greeted her warmly, offered her coffee, seemed genuinely eager to help however he could. Sarah asked the same questions detectives had asked in 1989. Where were you on the evening of June 14th? Did you know Rachel Morrison personally? Did you see anything unusual on the trail that day? Greg answered patiently, his story unchanged from what he'd told police 30 years earlier. He'd been home, he said. His wife could confirm it. He'd only known Rachel by sight, had been devastated when she disappeared, had volunteered to search because it felt like the right thing to do. Sarah thanked him and left, but something nagged at her. She contacted Greg's ex-wife, a woman named Linda who'd remarried and moved to Ohio. Linda was hesitant to talk at first, but Sarah persisted gently, explaining that even the smallest detail could help. Finally, Linda agreed to a phone call, and that's when the story began to crack. Linda remembered June 14th, 1989. She remembered it because it was one of the worst nights of her marriage. Greg had come home late, after 9 p.m., his clothes dirty, his hands scratched. When she'd asked where he'd been, he'd snapped at her, said he'd been working late on a job site. But Linda had called the site, and no one had been there. When she confronted him, Greg became furious, told her to stop questioning him, accused her of being paranoid. Linda had never told the police this. She'd been scared. Greg had a temper, and their marriage was already fragile. When detectives had called asking for an alibi, she'd confirmed what Greg told her to say. He'd been home. They'd been together. It was easier than dealing with his anger. But now, decades later, Linda's voice shook as she spoke. She'd always wondered, she told Sarah. After Rachel disappeared and Greg volunteered for the search, Linda had watched him closely. He seemed too invested, too eager to be involved. He'd come home every night exhausted, talking about the places they'd searched, the areas they'd covered. At the time, Linda had thought he was just being a good neighbor. But looking back, she wondered if there'd been something else driving him. Sarah's pulse quickened. She asked Linda if she'd noticed anything else strange around that time. Linda was quiet for a moment, then said yes. About a week after Rachel vanished, she'd found a pair of women's running shorts in the bed of Greg's truck. When she'd asked about them, Greg said he'd found them on the trail during the search, that he'd forgotten to turn them in to the police. Linda had believed him, but the shorts had never been mentioned in any evidence log. Sarah thanked Linda and hung up. Then she pulled the evidence inventory from 1989. There was no record of Greg Hartman turning in any clothing, no mention of shorts, no documentation of him finding anything significant during the search. She went back to Greg's file and started digging deeper. She looked at his work history, his addresses, his criminal record. Greg had no arrests, no history of violence. But in 1987, 2 years before Rachel disappeared, there'd been a complaint filed against him by a woman in Petoskey. She'd hired Greg to remodel her kitchen and had reported him to the police after he'd made unwanted advances, showing up at her house unannounced, calling her repeatedly after the job was finished. The complaint had been dropped when the woman moved out of state. Sarah cross-referenced the dates and locations. Greg had worked on projects all over northern Michigan in the late 1980s. She contacted police departments in nearby counties, asked if there'd been any similar cases, any unsolved disappearances or assaults involving women around that time. In Charlevoix County, there'd been a report of a jogger being followed by a man in a white pickup in 1988. The woman had described the driver as white, mid-20s, with dark hair and a beard. Greg Hartman had driven a white pickup in 1988 and matched that description. In Leelanau County, a woman had been attacked on a hiking trail in 1986. She'd fought off her assailant and escaped, but had only been able to provide a vague description. The case had never been solved. The pieces were scattered, circumstantial, not enough for an arrest. But Sarah felt it in her gut. She was on to something. She approached the lead detective on the cold case unit, a veteran named Tom Riley, who'd been with the department since the early 1990s. She showed him what she'd found, laid out the timeline, the inconsistencies in Greg's alibi, Linda's statement about the shorts. Tom listened carefully, then nodded. "Let's bring him in," Tom said. On a cold morning in November 2010, Greg Hartman was asked to come to the police station for a follow-up interview. He arrived on time, still cooperative, still eager to help. But this time, Sarah and Tom pressed harder. They confronted him with Linda's statement, with the complaint from Petoskey, with the inconsistencies in his story. Greg stayed calm at first, insisting he'd done nothing wrong. But as the interview stretched into its second hour, cracks began to show. "Why would your ex-wife lie?" Sarah asked. "She's bitter," Greg said. "The divorce was ugly. She's trying to hurt me." "What about the running shorts?" Tom pressed. "Why didn't you turn them in?" "I don't remember any shorts," Greg said, his voice rising. "That was 30 years ago. How am I supposed to remember every detail?" But Sarah could see it, the way his hands clenched, the way his eyes darted toward the door. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Greg," she said, "if you know something about Rachel Morrison, now's the time to tell us. It's been 3 decades. Her family deserves the truth." Greg stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm done talking," he said. "If you want to charge me with something, charge me. Otherwise, I'm leaving." They didn't have enough to hold him. Greg walked out of the station, and Sarah watched him go, frustration burning in her chest. But she wasn't giving up. Over the next year, Sarah worked the case relentlessly. She obtained a search warrant for Greg's property and found nothing. He'd lived in 3 different houses since 1989, and any evidence had long since been discarded or destroyed. She contacted the FBI, hoping they could assist with forensic genealogy or other advanced techniques. But without a body, there was little they could do. Bill Morrison met with Sarah regularly during this time. He was 72 now, his hair white, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes still burned with the same determination they'd held for 3 decades. "Do you really think it's him?" Bill asked one afternoon as they sat in Sarah's office. "I do," Sarah said. "But I need proof. Something concrete, and I'm running out of options." Bill reached across the desk and took her hand. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on her." Sarah's throat tightened. "I won't," she promised. And then, in 2015, the breakthrough came. A hiker named Kevin Marston was exploring an area deep in the woods near the Cherry Bend Trail, about 4 miles from where Rachel's shoes had been found. Kevin was an amateur naturalist, studying bird migration patterns, and he'd ventured off-trail into a section of forest that was rarely visited. As he pushed through thick underbrush, his boot caught on something half buried in the dirt. It was a bone. Kevin called the police immediately. Within hours, a forensic team was on site, carefully excavating the area. What they found made headlines across Michigan. It was Rachel Morrison, or what remained of her. Her skeleton was found in a shallow grave, covered with leaves and branches that had decayed over the decades. Scraps of fabric, her gray tank top and navy shorts, clung to the bones. And beside her, partially buried, was a small plastic bag containing her driver's license and a single earring. The medical examiner determined cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Rachel had been struck from behind, likely killed instantly. The angle and force of the blow suggested the attacker had been taller, stronger, someone she hadn't seen coming. Bill and Dorothy Morrison were notified on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah Lindgren drove to their house herself, sat with them in their living room, and told them as gently as she could that their daughter had been found. Dorothy collapsed into Bill's arms, her body racked with sobs. Bill held her, tears streaming down his face, whispering over and over, "She's home. She's finally home." The discovery reignited the investigation. With a body, there was now physical evidence to analyze. Forensic technicians combed through every fragment of bone, every piece of fabric, searching for DNA, and they found it. On Rachel's shorts, preserved by the dry soil and cool shade of the forest, were traces of male DNA. It was degraded, partial, but it was there. In 2016, Sarah submitted the DNA to a genealogical database, a new technique that had been used successfully in other cold cases. The technology compared the unknown DNA to profiles submitted by people researching their family trees, looking for genetic relatives who might lead back to the source. It took 6 months, but in October 2016, the database returned a match, a distant cousin, then a second, then a third. Sarah worked with a genetic genealogist, building a family tree, narrowing down the possibilities. And at the end of that tree, one name stood out: Greg Hartman. The DNA from Rachel's clothing was a partial match to Greg's genetic profile. It wasn't enough on its own to convict. The sample was too degraded. But combined with everything else Sarah had uncovered, Linda's statement, the inconsistencies in his alibi, the complaints from other women, it was enough for a warrant. On a cold November morning in 2016, 27 years after Rachel Morrison disappeared, Greg Hartman was arrested at his home and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest happened at 6 a.m., that particular hour when the world is caught between night and day. 4 police cruisers pulled up to Greg's modest ranch house on Maple Street. Neighbors who were up early getting ready for work watched from their windows as officers surrounded the property, hands on their weapons, voices sharp with commands. Greg answered the door in his bathrobe, coffee mug still in his hand. He looked genuinely confused at first, like this had to be some kind of mistake. Then he saw Sarah Lindgren standing behind the uniformed officers, her face set with grim determination, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition. Resignation. The look of a man who'd been waiting for this moment for nearly 3 decades. "Gregory Hartman, you are under arrest for the murder of Rachel Morrison," the lead officer said, and began reading him his rights. Greg's wife, his second wife, a woman named Patricia, who he'd married in 2003, stood in the doorway behind him. She was screaming, crying, insisting there must be some mistake. Her husband was a good man, she kept saying. He coached Little League. He volunteered at the church. He couldn't have killed anyone. But Sarah Lindgren had heard those protests before. She'd learned over her years in cold cases that monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like Little League coaches and church volunteers and friendly neighbors who wave hello when you mow your lawn. That was how they got away with it for so long. The news of the arrest spread through Traverse City like wildfire. By noon, it was the lead story on every local television station. Former teacher's murder solved after 27 years. Arrest made in Rachel Morrison cold case. Volunteer searcher charged with murder. He helped investigate. That last headline hit hardest. The realization that Greg Hartman hadn't just killed Rachel. He'd inserted himself into the investigation, had walked the same trails the search parties covered, had looked her parents in the eye, and offered his condolences while knowing exactly where their daughter's body lay buried in the woods. Bill Morrison got the call from Sarah Lindgren at 7 a.m., an hour after the arrest. He was 74 now, his hair completely white, his body bent from years of grief. When Sarah told him they'd made an arrest, that they had the man who'd killed his daughter, Bill sat down heavily in his kitchen chair and wept. Dorothy was in the bedroom, still sleeping. She'd had a bad night, as she often did, the kind of restless sleep plagued by dreams of Rachel calling out for help. Bill went to wake her, sat on the edge of the bed, and took her hand. "They got him," he said softly. "They got the man who killed our daughter." Dorothy's eyes opened. For a moment, she just stared at Bill, not comprehending. Then understanding dawned, and she made a sound that was part sob, part prayer. Bill held her while she cried, the two of them clinging to each other the way they had on that first terrible night 27 years ago when Rachel hadn't come home. "Who?" Dorothy finally asked. "Who was it?" "Greg Hartman," Bill said. "Do you remember him? He was one of the volunteers who helped search." Dorothy's face went pale. She did remember. A young man, polite, eager to help, married with a baby. He'd seemed so kind, so genuinely concerned. He'd stood in their living room one afternoon about a week after Rachel disappeared, drinking coffee Dorothy had made, looking at photos of Rachel on the mantel, offering words of comfort and hope. "He was in our house," Dorothy whispered. "We thanked him for helping search. We thanked him." The horror of that realization, the violation of it, would stay with Dorothy for the rest of her life. The killer had sat in their living room, had drunk their coffee, had looked them in the eyes and lied with every word he spoke. The trial began in the spring of 2017. The courthouse in Traverse City was a beautiful old building, built in 1923, with high ceilings and carved wooden benches and windows that let in golden afternoon light. But there was nothing beautiful about what happened inside its walls over those 6 weeks. The courtroom was packed every single day. The gallery seats filled an hour before proceedings began, people lining up outside in the cold March air just to get a spot inside. Rachel's story had gripped Traverse City for nearly 3 decades, and now, finally, people would hear the truth about what had happened to her. Bill and Dorothy Morrison sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution's table. Bill wore the same suit he'd worn to Rachel's college graduation, the only suit he owned. Dorothy dressed simply, a navy dress and pearls, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Their faces showed every day of the 27 years they'd waited for this moment. Behind them sat a section reserved for people whose lives Rachel had touched. Her former roommate, Jenna, now a high school history teacher with gray streaking her hair. Tom Brennan, the paralegal Rachel had been dating, now a judge, his own children grown, his eyes red from crying. Teachers from Elmwood Elementary, some retired, some still teaching, all carrying the memory of the colleague who'd never come back. And Emma Chen, now 35 years old, a social worker in Lansing, married with 2 daughters of her own. Emma held a folder in her lap that contained the rainbow drawing she'd given Rachel that last day, carefully preserved all these years. She'd brought it to show Rachel somehow that she'd never been forgotten, that the love she'd given to a shy 7-year-old had stayed with that girl, had shaped her, had made her want to help others the way Miss Morrison had helped her. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented Linda Hartman's testimony about Greg's scratched hands and dirty clothes the night Rachel disappeared, about his late arrival home, about his anger when she'd questioned him. They showed the jury the complaint from the woman in Petoskey, the reports of the jogger being followed in Charlevoix County, the pattern of behavior that suggested Greg Hartman had a history of targeting women. They called forensic experts who explained how DNA could survive in dirt for decades, how genealogical databases had led them to identify Greg as a match. They showed crime scene photographs of the shallow grave where Rachel's remains had been found, of her skeleton still wearing scraps of the gray tank top and navy shorts she'd been wearing that June day in 1989. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was degraded and unreliable, that Linda was a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge, that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. They called character witnesses who testified that Greg was a devoted father and grandfather, a man who'd never shown any signs of violence, a pillar of the community. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw through the facade of the friendly neighbor, the helpful volunteer, the devoted family man. They saw what Sarah Lindgren had seen, what the evidence clearly showed. Greg Hartman was a killer who'd hidden in plain sight for 27 years. On May 12, 2017, after 3 days of deliberation, The jury returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Bill Morrison buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Dorothy clutched Rachel's high school graduation photo to her chest, the same photo she'd carried with her every day of the trial, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Greg Hartman stood motionless as the verdict was read. His face showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of what he'd done. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Greg looked directly at Bill and Dorothy Morrison and spoke for the first time since the trial began. "I'm innocent," he said. "I didn't kill Rachel Morrison. You've convicted the wrong man." It was the final insult, the last twist of the knife. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence, with a jury that had seen through his lies, Greg Hartman couldn't admit what he'd done, couldn't give the Morrisons even that small measure of closure. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led Greg away in handcuffs, he didn't look back, didn't acknowledge his crying wife in the gallery, didn't show any recognition that he'd just lost his freedom forever. He simply walked out of the courtroom with his head held high, as if this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would eventually be corrected. But it wouldn't be. Greg Hartman would spend the rest of his life in a cell at the Kinross Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He would file appeals that would be denied. He would write letters to newspapers proclaiming his innocence that would go unpublished. And he would die, eventually, without ever confessing to what he'd done to Rachel Morrison on that June evening in 1989. Some people carry their lies to the grave. Greg Hartman would be one of them. For Bill and Dorothy, the verdict brought a complicated kind of peace. It wasn't the ending they'd hoped for when Rachel first went missing. They'd dreamed she'd be found alive, that she'd come home and tell them it had all been a terrible mistake. But that dream had died long ago. Now, they at least had answers. They knew what had happened. They knew who'd taken their daughter from them. And they knew he would never hurt anyone else. Rachel was buried on a bright Saturday in June, 28 years after she disappeared. Her grave overlooked Lake Michigan, the water she'd loved, the trails she'd run. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. Former students, now adults with children of their own. Teachers who'd worked alongside her. Neighbors who'd never stopped hoping. Sarah Lindgren stood near the back, her eyes red from crying. Emma Chen, the quiet girl who'd given Rachel the rainbow drawing, stood beside the grave with her own daughter, a little girl about the same age Emma had been when Miss Morrison vanished. She told her daughter about the teacher who'd made her feel seen, who'd hugged her when she was scared, who'd never come back. And she cried for all the years Rachel had missed, all the lives she'd never touched, all the students she'd never taught. Bill Morrison spoke at the service, his voice steady and strong. He talked about Rachel's laugh, the way it filled a room. He talked about her kindness, how she'd spent her weekends volunteering at the animal shelter, how she'd loved every stray cat and injured bird that crossed her path. He talked about the beach glass she collected, how she'd said each piece was a little miracle, something broken and made beautiful by time. "My daughter was a miracle," Bill said, his eyes shining. "And even though she's gone, the love she gave to this world is still here, in every student she taught, in every friend she made, in every person who refused to forget her. That love doesn't die. It just changes shape." Dorothy couldn't speak. She stood beside the casket, one hand resting on the smooth wood, and let the tears come. Later, after the service, she would plant wildflowers on Rachel's grave. Purple lupine and black-eyed Susans. the same flowers that bloomed along the Cherry Bend Trail every summer. In the months that followed, life slowly found a new rhythm for the Morrisons. Bill continued his Sunday walks on the trail, but they felt different now, less desperate, more like a communion with his daughter's memory. Dorothy began volunteering with a support group for families of missing persons, offering the kind of understanding only someone who'd lived through it could give. Sarah Lindgren stayed in touch with them, visiting every few months, bringing updates on cases she was working. She'd been promoted to lead detective in the cold case unit, and she carried Rachel's story with her into every investigation. Rachel had taught her something important. That time doesn't erase the truth. That families deserve answers, even decades later. That justice delayed isn't always justice denied. In 2019, Emma Chen published a children's book dedicated to Rachel Morrison. It was about a teacher who turned into a star and watched over her students from the sky. The book won awards and was read in classrooms across Michigan. Proceeds went to the Rachel Morrison Foundation, which continued to fund searches for missing persons and support their families. Greg Hartman remains in prison. He's appealed his conviction twice, and both appeals have been denied. In interviews, he continues to insist he's innocent, that he was wrongly convicted, that the evidence against him was circumstantial and unreliable. But the courts disagree, and so do the people who knew Rachel. In the end, this is a story about many things. About a young woman whose life was stolen on a summer evening. About parents who refused to stop loving their daughter, even when hope seemed impossible. About a detective who saw an old file and decided it deserved another look. About DNA that waited in the dirt for 26 years before it could speak. And about a community that never forgot the teacher who'd made them believe in kindness. Rachel Morrison's story didn't end the way anyone wanted, but it ended. And for Bill and Dorothy, for the students who remembered her, for everyone who'd searched and hoped and prayed, that ending mattered. Not because it erased the pain, but because it honored Rachel's life, because it said her story was important, because it proved that even when evil tries to erase someone, love can bring them home. On the anniversary of Rachel's death, Bill Morrison still walks the Cherry Bend Trail. He's 84 now, slower than he used to be, but determined. He carries a small bag of beach glass in his pocket, pieces he's collected over the years from their family trips to the shore. At the spot where Rachel's shoes were found, he leaves a piece of glass on the flat rock. Purple, green, blue, each one smoothed and shaped by the water, each one a little miracle. And in the kitchen of the house where Rachel grew up, Dorothy keeps the jar of beach glass on the windowsill, right where Rachel left it. Sometimes the light catches it just right, sending rainbows across the wall, and for just a moment, it feels like Rachel is there, humming while she makes coffee, drawing smiley faces on spelling tests, getting ready to teach another day of third grade. The jar will stay there for as long as Dorothy lives, a reminder that broken things can still be beautiful, that love survives even death, that some lights, once lit, never fully go out. Rachel Morrison was 28 years old when she died. She taught for 6 years. She touched hundreds of lives. And though her life was cut short, the ripples of her kindness continue to spread, touching people who never met her, inspiring change in a world that desperately needs it. This is the story of Rachel Morrison, a daughter, a teacher, a friend, a woman who loved wildflowers and beach glass and children who struggled with spelling, a woman who deserved so much more time than she got, but also a woman who will never be forgotten. Her name is carved in stone now, overlooking the lake she loved, and every Sunday, her father walks the trail she ran, carrying pieces of glass that catch the light and make rainbows. Because that's what Rachel did. She found the broken things and made them beautiful. And even in death, that's the legacy she leaves behind. Beautiful, unbreakable, eternal.